Establishing central control immediately opens up lines for rapid piece development. Developing the knight towards the center immediately prepares for flexible pawn structures and potential tactical skirmishes. Seizing central space and preparing pawn advances, white immediately challenges black's knight and aims for a strong pawn center. Opening the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop offers solid development and prepares for central pawn advances. Developing the knight here prepares kingside castling and reinforces control over central squares, a sound positional buildup. Developing the bishop to this square immediately pins the knight, creating central pawn tension and forcing white to consider their knight's safety. Developing the knight further solidifies control over the center and prepares for castling, preventing any immediate central breakthroughs by black. Challenging the center's pawn structure head-on, this move ignites immediate dynamic play and seeks active piece development. Challenging black's bishop now forces a decision, potentially gaining a tempo or simplifying the center. Liberating the bishop from its confinement opens up interesting imbalances. Opening the b-file grants powerful pressure and a potential passed pawn, but creates structural weaknesses. Unpinning the knight and immediately targeting the queenside pawn creates tactical dynamism. Challenging black's active queen, white secures their king and prepares for central pawn advances, aiming to exploit the doubled c-pawns. Challenging the queenside structure, black forces a confrontation and aims to activate their pieces. Asserting central influence and preparing for queenside expansion, this knight redeployment now solidifies white's pawn structure, anticipating black's further development. Exchanging knights simplifies the position, potentially easing black's queenside pressure and opening the way for development. Opening the d-file to pressure black's queenside and preparing for active piece play by developing the knight. Solidifying the center and opening lines for the queen offers the pawn majority a chance to advance. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for development, this move clears the way for the king's bishop and reinforces central control. Opening the center forcefully, black challenges white's pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's development, potentially creating dynamic attacking chances. Capturing the pawn immediately loosens the center and opens the d-file for potential piece activity. Boldly reclaiming central space, this advance shatters the pawn structure and opens diagonals for your pieces to exploit. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal, this piece now exerts pressure on the kingside and prepares for a potential castling maneuver. Preempting any kingside expansion by white, h6 safeguards the f7 pawn from potential discoveries while aiming to free the g8 knight. Safeguarding the monarch solidifies the pawn structure, preparing for middle game operations. A wise decision, tucking the king away safely behind castled pawns, preparing for middle game skirmishes. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aims to shatter black's central pawn structure and open lines towards the king. Unleashing the knight to d7 seeks to reroute it to a more active square, potentially g6, while bolstering the kingside and preparing for central action. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aggressively targets black's king and aims to dominate the center. The knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing the weak pawns and potential attacking opportunities on the kingside. Injecting a knight into the heart of black's territory, this aims to exploit the slightly loosened pawn structure and potentially launch an attack. Strategically, the queen abandons the center, seeking shelter on the queenside, a somewhat passive repositioning that might cede initiative. Sacrificing a knight to open the f-file aims to exploit the slightly compromised dark squares around black's king. Reclaiming the queen to the center now challenges white's central pawn majority, aiming to disrupt its structure and gain attacking potential. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure with a timely retreat, preparing to anchor the knight on a more dynamic central square. Initiating pressure on the b-file, this piece activates, eyeing potential pawn advances and challenging white's king safety. Asserting dominion over the d-file, white aims to connect rooks and exploit the open lines arising from black's pawn weaknesses. Shaping the queenside pawn structure aims to activate the rook, yet weakens the dark squares around the king. Securing the king's safety with a pawn shield is a prudent, if passive, defensive maneuver. Unleashing the bishop to c8 potentially activates an impressive diagonal, eyeing the weakened kingside structure. Challenging the bishop, this move seeks to exploit the vulnerable dark squares around black's king and potentially open lines for an attack. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Opening the c-file grants immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, creating imbalances. Puncturing white's pawn structure revitalizes black's queenside activity, aiming to exploit the open files. Centralizing the pawn opens up the c-file for the rook and puts pressure on black's queenside pawn chain. The rook now occupies a more active file, preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. Reclaiming the open b-file will put immediate pressure on black's position, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure. A sensible repositioning, aiming to activate the rook and contest the d-file. Sacrificing a rook to expose the black king offers fascinating tactical possibilities. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the file and offers black counterplay, though it does leave white's queenside pawn structure somewhat compromised. Opening the e-file after the exchange invites queenside pressure and challenges black's central pawn majority. Consolidating forces on the queenside offers a strategic counterplay against white's isolated pawn. Asserting queenside presence, this squares the rook and prepares for future pawn advances. Bringing the bishop to the long diagonal, the defender aims to disrupt white's piece coordination and contest control of the open lines. Unlocking the queen's diagonal attack on a7, immediately threatening the vulnerable bishop and potentially creating passed pawns later. The bishop retreats, abandoning the defense of the pawn and surrendering central control to white's dominant queen. Reasserting pressure on the queenside, white aims to exploit the open files and potential for piece activity. Initiating a pawn thrust on the queenside aims to disrupt white's coordination. Securing the queenside flank by advancing the pawn initiates a strategic repositioning. Recognizing the lack of immediate threats, black prioritizes the king's safety, subtly preparing for potential central pawn pushes. Opening the queenside files aggressively, white seeks to penetrate black's defenses with this pawn thrust. Seizing the open file and eliminating that annoying pawn structure opens up dynamic possibilities. The white queen aggressively penetrates, threatening both the pawns and the vulnerable king's side. This forces a confrontation on the queen's side, potentially liberating the rook for activity. Capturing the pawn creates an open file, but abandons central pawn control. Targeting the queenside pawn structure, this thrust aims to exploit white's isolated doubled pawns and create an unbalanced game. Securing the queen's outpost on the 7th rank solidifies positional dominance, hinting at a potential endgame advantage. Initiating a rook lift aims to exploit the weakened dark squares and potentially swing the attack towards white's kingside. Restricting black's rook offers a glimmer of hope in this otherwise challenging position. Asserting control over the central files now becomes crucial, as the queens are poised for a decisive exchange of blows. Improving king's safety by moving him from the dangerous open diagonal is paramount. Probing the queenside and challenging the rook's outpost, this move ignites a latent positional struggle on the file. Securing the queenside pawn structure prevents black's rooks from gaining dangerous entry while repositioning for counterplay. Luring the rook to an exposed position allows white to exploit the open diagonal for the queen. Seizing the open file now creates pressure and forces black to react defensively. The queen's sacrifice is audacious, aiming to disrupt white's queenside expansion and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. Simplifying to an endgame where white's bishop now has free reign across the board. Exposing the king now with the rook sacrifice invites a swift checkmate sequence. Capturing the pawn opens the e-file, threatening to overwhelm your king's defenses. The bishop's repositioning aims to contest the open files and potentially hinder white's queen's influence. Probing the weak squares around black's compromised pawn structure is the priority now.